Let those who have two shoes sell one and buy a sword. Those with two trousers should sell one and buy a sword. Because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is not on the streets. This revolution is not about burning cars. This revolution is in the mind. Because if you are not the owner of your own mind, your body will be a tool that your oppressor will use to enslave your people. Steve Bantu Biko said that the most important weapon in the hands of the oppressor is not nuclear weapon, it's not atomic bombs, it's not, I don't know what else we can think of. It's just the mind of the oppressed. If they can be able to conquer your mind, they have been able to conquer and enslave yourself entirely and your future generation. Peace and power to all African people from wherever you find yourself. Peace and love and peace and blessing, peace and light to all of you. This is Kabbalah here once again from the African Continental Unity Party in our weekly discussion where we think about and we talk about Africa for African development. What we aim after is one thing, the African liberation and emancipation. So please kindly support us by sharing this video, by liking the video, by giving us some thumbs and sharing it. It's going to be very productive. It's one of the ways you can contribute to this agenda of African liberation and emancipation. So today, I just want to discuss something quickly about development. I've been listening to the news everywhere around the continent. Most of topics that are being discussed is about development. And I've read a couple of books out of so many books that have been written about these subjects of African development. Essays, we don't even talk about conferences, seminars, all related to the African development. So the question is really, what is development for us as African people? Because when we don't understand what we do, we may be doing something that is even dangerous to ourselves. Now, in this live, I'm attempting to give you a perspective of what development has been so that we can think about what development should be. And maybe if you are interested about what we have been thinking already about development, you can obviously join us in ACUP or look for more information related to the African Continental Unity Party and find out what we think about African development and actually what we have been doing or what we have started to do for the achievement of that African development that we're talking about. Now, for understanding of what has been African development so far, we need to look back in the history starting from the post-colonial period, because that is where almost the current studies of Africa are basing, which is wrong because as the professor Sheikh Anta Diop told us, he said the African studies will remain in a vacuum so far until we go back to the period, pre-colonial period, to see what Africa was and base our education there. Because most of studies that are conducted currently are based on colonial Africa, which is not really Africa, which is Africa that has been already modified, infiltrated, or alienated from its roots. So now, when we talk about development, actually, the modern development philosophy as discussed here and there, it's starting with the end of the World War II, with the President Truman speech on development. The end of World War II, that is where the modern studies of development started, and the idea of development was to rebuild Europe, which was torn apart by the World War II. That's where the studies and analysis of development actually started. And the World Bank that we have today, initially it was called the World Bank for Reconstruction and the International Monetary Fund. They were created to help Europe for its reconstruction after the World War II. And after the reconstruction was achieved, in 1950s, 1955s, somewhere around there, they had now to turn their mind or their focus to Africa to see how they can better, not develop Africa as they did in Europe, but to exploit Africa. That is where now the notions, foreign notions or European notions of development were poured into Africa. So as we gained what is commonly known as independence, which we don't agree with always, which we can agree to disagree. If you think that you are independent, well, I don't think so. Now, after the 1960s, the period that is called the independence period for Africa, there were now few educated people in Africa. And colonialists, they knew what they were doing during the colonialism period. They did not want to educate African people because they knew that at some point African people will reverse the order of colonialism. And therefore, for us to remain in power, we must create a situation whereby Africans are not educated enough so that they can always run to us for assistance. And they planned it well. They engineered the African society that we have today, and they succeeded, so to say, in creating the situation that we have today in Africa. So there were only few who were educated in colonialism, and they were educated to eventually execute the orders or the colonial order in Africa, or to manage the colonial enterprise in Africa. They were not educated in a sense that would challenge the colonial rule. So after the independence, what happened is that we found ourselves with institutions to run. Let's say, for example, in the Congo, after independence, we had like 30 graduates from what I read. 30 people who were graduates. They couldn't manage the whole country. Everyone wanted things to happen. All the opportunities that were prevented from people during the colonial period. Now, all the people now wanted those opportunities immediately, and it was impossible. So, because obviously it was impossible because the new government needed money to run, the country, to pay the civil workers and all these things, and which it didn't have because all the reserve was actually plundered by colonialists as they were moving. They took all the money, shifted to foreign banks and stuff like that. So the country was actually in turmoil. So we didn't have a choice but to run back to go back to the former colonial masters to ask them for assistance. That was the situation. That's why I'm saying there was nothing like independence. So that is where the first notion of development came into existence. It was called modernization. Africans were told, for you to develop, for you to become like Europe, right? You need to apply the principle of modernization. And modernization in itself means that Africans have to emulate the social model or the social structures that exist in the West. They have to replicate them in Africa for African development to take place. So in order for you to replicate whatever that is happening in the Western society, you must undermine your culture, you must undermine your language, you must undermine your social values, you must undermine your names, all the elements that went on for millennia in the forming of an African identity had to be destroyed in order to adopt the modern or civilized ways of living, which is European, because the African way of living or the African worldview was considered as backward. Don't forget your history. Don't forget what happened or the consideration that your oppressor had about you. You were not considered as a human being. You were considered as backwards. And for you to become or to enter into the category of human being or into the category of civilized people, you had to remove the names such as Kwame so that you become Stephen. An example. You had to remove the names such as Kabbalah for you to be called John, for example. And you had to go through an education that does not, promote your language or your culture, but the education in which you are taught to speak and to think like a French or like a British. Because remember, a language is not just a way of communicating. A language is a way of thinking and a way of looking at the world. That is what the language is a masterpiece of a culture. So, all the books for education that we have read, we had to read. All the education tools that we had to use were constructed in French or in English or in Portuguese, depending on who colonized you. So all these were part of the modernization theory for the African development. And our traditional chief who knew our lands, they knew our culture, they knew everything about our society. They were actually removed from the authority in the political institutions. Now we had these Uncle Toms who are educated in the colonial system to become now rulers and masters of the new society. So that the traditional chiefs who are the custodians of African morality and African culture are now pushed apart or pushed away. So this was all part of the modernization theory for Africa to become developed, or Africa to become like Europe, or actually Africa to become like little French or little British or little Portugal, so to say, because that is what we call, emulation or emulating something. Apart from the what you call modernization theory, because it did not succeed as we moved around some years 1980, somewhere around there came another theory that was called industrialization. Now, the West again came to Africa and said, for you to develop, you must industrialize. You must move from village, because village centers of backwardness. So you need to build the urban areas. You must have bridge, you must have roads, you must have all these industries and produce things and stuff like that, which is good, by the way. But for Africa to have those industries, they had to go to the World Bank and borrow money from the World Bank. Now, they have to take that money back to the West and hire experts, right? And buy some machines to come and build industry in Africa, which means they had to take the money and bring that money back to Africa, to Europe, to pay the experts in development so that they can come and advise our governments on how to build industries, where to build industries, and what to do with those industries. And the remaining story, Africa indebted itself in a way that it was impossible to pay. And this was, actually substantiated by Thomas Sankara at African Union when he said, we cannot pay these debts because these debts are what creates poverty in Africa. And you know what happened to him? He stood against the debt and Thomas Sankara was killed. So this is another agenda of industrialization or economic development that brought Africa in this cycle of debt where we are today, and where that the money that we borrow goes into sponsoring or supporting the luxury life of the leaders, so that they can fly rather in a private jets to go to London, to go to UK, to China, to borrow more money, and the money get to be paid with the blood of the poor people who you are and who I am. So all these philosophies are coming from West, and today we are dealing with another theory about development. It's called neoliberalism. You know what neoliberalism now means? This is very dangerous now. It's every time a particular theory fails, they don't think about coming up with something, or Africans, we don't think about coming out with something from ourselves, our own perspective, something that can eventually help us. We always look to the same masters to tell us, now, this theory has failed. What can we do now? And those are the ones who now must come up with another solution, right? to our own problems. Now they have now what is called a neoliberal theory of development. Now this neoliberalism, what does it mean simply? It means that the government should reduce its power and its intervention in the drafting or in managing of the country's economy, or drafting of the policies that have to manage the economy of the country, and should open the way to foreign enterprises that must come and manage our economy, so to say. They must come and then obviously invade our countries with their products, and undermine our local production. As you know, today in Africa, the local farmers in Africa are suffering because they cannot compete with cheap product that is being powered in our countries from Germany, from China, from I don't know where. One example, striking example, is in Cameroon, where there's a community of onion farmers who were surviving by producing onions, and Cameroon had to, as a single country, imagine, had to sign this deal of free trade with European Union. Not even one country, but European Union of a number of 28 countries signing a deal with one country called Cameroon. This deal is all about open borders of products, no restrictions, no tax, no whatever. But Cameroon does not have the capacity to produce to be equal to the 28 countries who are members of the European Union. Now, what happened is that Germany is able now to bring more onions in Cameroon, and it has killed the business of this community who was actually surviving through the cultivation of onions. And these people now have to abandon their farms, have to go now, abandon their villages to go in towns to look for jobs. And the result, unemployment, poverty, and all this decay that we are actually protesting against in Africa. So this is one of the consequences of neoliberal. So it's to say that the government must not intervene in subsidizing local farmers, because the Cameroonian government had maybe a choice to give subsidies to these local farmers of onions so that they can also have the industrial capacity of production and they become competitive to the cheaper onion coming from Germany. But the government is not supposed to do that. Is prevented from doing that because that is the philosophy of neoliberalism. And how does the government is unable to do that? To do that is being enabled to do that is through the debt, because now when you go to the IMF and to the World Bank to borrow money, the condition that comes with that money that we call the structural adjustment program states that the government is not supposed to use the money that is borrowing from IMF or World Bank. The government is not supposed to use that money either to give subsidies to the local farmers to actually boost the production. The government is not supposed to use that money in some economic areas of the country. That money is supposed to be only used to pay the what you call the state agents. When you borrow the money that you are supposed to pay back with interest, but you don't use it for economic purpose, you use it to pay, civil servants, to use it to fly in private jet for your trips around the world and stuff like that. How are you going to pay back that money and pay the interest? And this is the situation in which we are today. That's why I said the neoliberal policy is even more dangerous. Now, when you bring all these policies together, all these philosophies of development that have been brought into Africa, they are based on one thing. African society is backward. It must emulate what the West has done so that it can develop. Let me repeat that again. Then all these philosophy, I didn't mention all of them anyway. When you bring all of them together, the underlying philosophy or principle is that for Africa to develop, it must do as the West has done so that it can develop. Africa must adopt the ways of life of the Western society to develop. That is why they talk more about globalism, integration. So we must abandon our culture, our traditions, our way of looking. We must become all Muslim, we must become all Christian, we must become all westernized, so to say, right? So that we can see development. Now, what do we say as African people now? As pure African or Afrocentric thinkers, as Pan-Africanists, what do we say about this kind of development philosophies that have been advocated since 1960s up until today? Africa is still in the situation where it is today. Nothing has changed, even though we've applied all these philosophies. And most of our leaders are still running to the West to get more of these theories and philosophies. They don't even consider our African thinkers. They still considering Plato's and all these Western, barbarians to get what they think for Africa to develop. We think, first of all, that there's no European solution to the African problem, because the African problem is a creation of European people. Therefore, there cannot be European solution to the African problem. Just as you cannot expect two kind of fruits coming out of one tree. Each tree is got its own kind of fruits. If you want two kind of a different fruits or a different type of fruits, you must go for a different tree. Right? So there's no solution that comes from European mind that will be applicable and that will be able to create what we want, which is African liberation and African emancipation. Because African liberation and emancipation is or are the threat to what we call European existence or European prosperity. We must understand that. Now, because all these philosophies are based on copycats, of what West has done. What is our ancestor John Henry Clark tell us about copying other people? He said, every time that you think for you to become better, you must copy what other people have done, or you must become a photocopy of other people. You are making yourself a prisoner of the people you are imitating. So even if they don't build a jail for you, even if they don't bind you with stills, the psychological prison of our mind, or the psychological chains of our mind, are very, very important and heavy than any jail that can bind you. Every time you begin to think for you to develop, you must become a copycat of other people. You are making yourself a prisoner of those people. Even if they don't put you in a physical jail, the psychological jail of your mind is more important than any physical thing that can bind you. So this is where our understanding begins. So now let's look to the West. The West that we are following, the West that we think is the model for our development. Really, is the Western development inspiring sustainability, hope, and prosperity for future generations? These are important questions that we need to ask. And for us to answer these questions, we must look into the Western society, what is happening right now in the Western society, because we might be following a blind person, blindly following a blind person who is using a stick to walk, and when he falls, we all gonna fall together. And this is what is happening now. When I look at Western society or Western development and its consequences, I'm afraid that we are doing a very disadvantage to ourselves by trying to emulate what the Western society is busy doing. For example, African societies, Kemet, as you call it, Egypt, we sustained developed societies among the rest of the nations in the world for millennials. You can remember how many dynasties existed in Egyptian, Africa for a long time, right? For many, many, many years. And there was sustainability. There was no such thing called as environmental catastrophes and stuff like that. But look, for example, consider America. It's a country that is 100 years old. American glory is less than 100 years old. But look the catastrophe that American development has already produced in the world. Today we are dealing with what you call global warming, environmental catastrophe. For this month alone, I've seen the flood that have killed people in India as we're speaking right now. Heavy floods, heavy rains in India. In Russia, floods there. In Philippines, floods there. In, I don't know, there was one in, I think, Afghanistan, floods. So we have a lot of natural catastrophes that are, according to all assessment, are resulting from the global warming or from the environmental degradation, which also has resulted from the heavy industries that we call development today. So can we really follow this kind of development that is damaging the environment? Because in the psyche of European people, they believe that the entire world is created to be dominated by a man, right? And every time you think that you are the one who has to dominate something, especially the nature, then you begin to forget that the nature is what sustains your life. You breathe because the nature is there. So when you begin to think that God has created me to be the master of the world and to control and dominate the nature and the whole world, right? You are able now to cut down, to chop down the trees, to create deforestation, to remove the mountains that were there to regulate the winds and all these things. And the result can be nothing different from what we are facing today. Global warming, environmental degradation, natural catastrophes, and you name them. The second thing, as a result of the Western development that we want to emulate, is that this development has created what we call how can I put it? Look at the Western society right now is struggling with its number, right? The Western society, they have a struggle of demography. What? That's the word I was looking for. The Western development has created demographic catastrophe. It means the Western population is in decline right now. They are thinking, because as we're speaking now, in few years from now, the white people in Europe, for example, in America, will be less and lesser than the other who are today called the minorities. So other people are increasing in the number, and the Western society, particularly white people, are declining in the number. That is why they talk a lot about African population growing, exponentially. It's not because growing is a bad thing to us, it's because they see themselves as diminishing. They are today representing about 12% of the world's population. And this is a kind of modernized society that you want to emulate, to say, no, I want one kid, I want two kids, polygamy is backwardness, but homosexuality is a democracy, is a development. In a family, you cannot have 3 kids or 4 kids, 1 kid, 2 kids, fine, but they are in decline. Look now, they are in crisis of people. Germany recently, I think 2019, Angela Merkel opened the borders to welcome, I think, 1 million of foreigners, of refugees. And many people were saying that, no, the Angela Merkel's fine, Germany is a good country that is open to refugees and stuff like that. No, it was not love for refugees. It was because there was 1 million employments that the German people didn't want to do themselves. Therefore, they had to get these immigrants to come and fill in the gap. We need to understand this. So European people are in decline. Even China, they had that policy of 2 kids, right? And as we're speaking now, they have already banned that policy. They have opened, to have more kids in a family. And in Africa, we are discussing about this. We say, no. When we see somebody saying, I've got 5 kids, we're not this backwardness. We must have 2 kids. So the people that we are trying to imitate by having few kids are already in crisis, but we still want to imitate them. This is the question. Where are we going with this kind of development? But the most important element, number 3, is we want to imitate the Western civilization for our own development. Who said that the West has developed itself through hard working, through projects of development? No, the West is not built on that. The Western society is built on blood, on destruction of other people, on war and conquering other people. So now if they say we must do as they did to develop ourselves, are they willing to be oppressed by us as they did to us so that we can emulate that developmental model for African development? These are the questions that we need to ask, brothers and sisters. And by responding to these questions, we don't have any option of following the Western development because it is already in crisis. A white man is in crisis with his own family, and he's walking like a blind that is using a stick, and there's no need to follow him because we will fall in the pits where he is right now. The white man is in charge of the world just for 100 years, for a few hundred years to say, but the world is in turmoil. We don't know when the world will end. There's this thing that is called a doomsday clock. It's a clock that is ticking toward the midnight, and midnight means the end of the world. That end of the world can happen through nuclear war or can happen through environmental catastrophe of greater magnitude. And some of the thinkers of the world have begun to think that we have started already the sixth extinction, because the world since its beginning has five extinctions. The fifth extinction is the one that wiped out the 3/5 of all creatures in the world. I mean, the 3/3, the 2/3 of all the creatures in the world. You know about dinosaurs that were wiped out by the fifth extinctions. Now we are starting already the sixth extinction. There are a lot of species in the world that are disappearing right now, dying, and getting extincted just like that because of environmental or global warming or all the conditions that are man-made that we know already. So is this really a model of development that we want to emulate for Africa? I guess no, and I'm sure no. I'm sure the answer is no, because we are able to produce something new. Dr. John Henry Clark said to us that we as African people, we are the one who brought the first civilization to the world. And the world today has misused the knowledge that we produced. The world today has abused, has abused its power. So it's only us as Africans, since we are the first who brought civilization to the world, we are the ones who can save the world from the lost track in which on which it is today. It means we are the one who can give to the world its last humanity again. And we are doing right that now with the African Continental Unity Party. So now, if you want to understand what is development for us as African people, according to an Afrocentric perspective, I invite you to join the African Continental Unity Party. This is not just like a party as political parties that we are tired of. This is a community development party. This is a grassroots movement whereby people, we are in charge of our lives, and people, we have the voice in whatever matter that affects our lives directly or indirectly. So I invite you to join the ACUP, the African Continental Unity Party. Get to know more what we stand for, and eventually, if you are interested in the future of Africa, especially in the reconstruction of Africa as a global power base, join us and let's work us together. Your skills, my skills, your power, your capability plus mine can make up a good tool, a very important or very potent weapon that can be used for creating the Africa that we want. If you don't know what to do, we can train you. We have the academy that is called the Free-Minded Pan-African Academy, where we create new leaders for African leadership, new leaders in politics and in business world. If you want to invest the money, we have what is called Ubuntu Solidarity Society. We will put our money together to invest in projects that have high potential, high potential of returns or of profits for our economic advancement. Peace and power to all of you for your time and for paying attention to this video. If you have 2 shoes, please sell one and buy a sword. If you have 2 trousers, please sell one and buy a sword, because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is no longer on streets. It's not about burning cars. This revolution is in the mind. Because if you are not in charge of the mind, your body will be a very important instrument that your oppressor will use to conquer and to enslave you. Steve Bantu Biko said, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Peace and power, peace and love, peace and light, freedom or death. We are here for that. Kindly support us by sharing the video or by liking it. It's going to be a great thing. Until then, peace and power.